So the first big element of looking at the narratives that we hold, the stories that we hold about how we show up in life, is looking at how we define masculinity and mature masculinity, and how we show up with respect to our own sense of assuredness. How do thoughts around self-doubt, limiting beliefs, inner critics start to show up for us? And I think for men, there is, and I certainly can speak for myself, but I think also a lot of men who show up to do this kind of work, that a big part of our programming is, am I doing a good job as a man?
Yeah, am I good enough, right? I think that's a big one.
Right. It's huge.
Yeah.
And so it looks a little bit like it's twofold, like it's masculinity and it's also self-doubt and limiting beliefs. But for men, the two get really intertwined with one another.
Well, welcome back, everybody, to this week's episode of the Men's Collective podcast. I am here with my co-founder, Pierre, and we are breaking down the 5 pillars of purpose. Last episode, we covered the first, which is perspective. If you haven't listened to that episode, go back, check it out, because these are kind of building upon one another and around kind of what the cohort or what the Men's Collective is kind of foundational for what we're building and co-creating here. And so this week is about and around programming. And so, Pierre, what is programming? How are we defining it? So can you tell us about what that is?
Sure. Well, programming builds on the last P, which is perspective. And in perspective, we look at our own vision of fulfillment, how we show up in the world at present, and really built upon some of the narratives that we tell ourselves about who we are, who we've been, where we've been, and where we're going. And programming begins to delve more into thought patterns that we hold around important ways that we show up in our lives. And so programming has really led us into 2 big areas. The first is around mature masculinity. It is around the stories that we've been taught about being a man, defining how those stories relate to how we see ourselves today, and an invitation to consider and really build a tailored definition for mature masculinity. What does it mean for you and I to be great men? What can you do as someone who might honor that definition? And how do you find yourself? How do we find ourselves experiencing belonging and brotherhood among men? And that's a core element that often comes up when we talk about programming. But it's not the only one, because another really big area that naturally emerges is the stories that we might tell ourselves around where we're showing up well and where we experience self-doubt. So the first big element of looking at the narratives that we hold, the stories that we hold about how we show up in life, is looking at how we define masculinity and mature masculinity, and how we show up with respect to our own sense of assuredness. How do thoughts around self-doubt, limiting beliefs, inner critics start to show up for us? And I think for men, there is, and I certainly can speak for myself, but I think also a lot of men who show up to do this kind of work, that a big part of our programming is, am I doing a good job as a man?
Yeah, am I good enough, right? I think that's a big one.
Right. It's huge.
Yeah.
And so it looks a little bit like it's twofold, like it's masculinity and it's also self-doubt and limiting beliefs. But for men, the two get really intertwined with one another.
Yeah.
A big part of how am I showing up? Am I good enough? Is really intertwined with, am I man enough?
Absolutely. I can't even count,
Yeah.
honestly, how often I hear that over the past 10 years of working with men. And as you know, you're nodding along, like we both have it. It's quite pervasive, this how intertwined it really is, that this idea of shame and how we see ourselves of like not enough, how so linked that is to therefore I'm not a man, or I'm not man enough. Like those are so uh, twisted in a way, especially around how we've been programmed to what it means to be a man, what it means to be a masculine man, what it means to be. And this comes from various cultures. I mean, I've worked with men, as I'm sure of you have, from different cultural backgrounds, different ages. I would say there's so much shared experience, and again, unique differences for sure, but there's definitely this shared experience, at least in the West, in America, what it means to be a man, and how we've been programmed as men, in some ways, in healthy ways and good ways, and in a lot of ways, the kind of rigid, narrowed, kind of constricted ways around
Yeah.
what it means to be a man and to have value and to be not enough.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. It's interesting because this comes up often when we think about a desire to show up as a better person. I mean, in a lot of ways, the attributes that maybe bind every man in the collective is a desire to become a better man.
Mm.
And a lot of that can be encapsulated by what it means to be a better person. But just as you were saying, it's inevitably influenced by gender, especially for men. Our desire for growth, betterment, it's likely to be colored by how we view ourselves as men, how our goals align with masculine ideas and ideals, I suppose, and how we see ourselves belonging within a larger tribe of men.
Yeah, absolutely. And really the final question, like, why is this important? Like, why should we care? Why should we take guys through this whole process? I mean, we kind of answered it, but if you could sum it up, like, why is this so important right now as men?
Yeah. Well, I think it's important for all sorts of reasons, but maybe one of the most important reasons is that it takes this conversation out of a place of hiding and shame, because there's so much wrapped up in what it means to be a man and masculinity, both good and bad. And, men are feeling it in many ways. Many men feel aware of how we should not show up.
Yeah.
But at a loss for what it means to show up with a mature, healthy version of masculinity.
Yeah.
It's more than just a trivial part of who we are. And for many men, it can be a call to a bolder, braver action that unites us, regardless of gender.
Yeah. To your point, I think there is so much about how not to show up. That term that's been around for a while, the toxic masculinity, and we're not going to go unpack that today. But yeah, I think there's so much that we know, like, hey, that's not healthy or that's not good. So we all have this kind of a collective awareness of, okay, yeah. But to your point, and I think to think of Matt Carlson, that is our friend, who's a researcher and doing a lot of work around men's masculinities, and he coined the term positive masculinities. That he said the same thing, that hey, we all kind of know what not to do, but where's the roadmap of what to do? Like none of us could really, not none of us, a lot of us have a struggle with defining. Okay, what does really mature, healthy, positive masculinity look like? And a lot of people scratch their head. I don't know, and so I think there's such a need to unpack, to work together, to create, to define. So there's a structure, but a loose structure, guidelines of like, this is what we're really aiming at, right? Not rigid, but here's kind of what we see. And it is kind of a collective, it's collective in nature.
Very much.
And kind of wrestling with that. And what does that mean to each individual man? Well, I think there's going to be some shared experiences there, shared common characteristics. Absolutely. And there might even be some unique ones as well. And so it's kind of more expansive. It's more integrative, right? It's inclusive rather than othering and separating and causing disintegration. So I think it's so important for the day that we live in and have been living in, that we need something. We need to work with men and ourselves as what are we, even myself and you, it's like, how are we defining that? How does it mean? What does it mean to us? And the parts that we're wrestling with, right? That
For
we're
sure.
growing in and trying to understand in a world that's ever changing and evolving, right? Because it's evolving. I mean, my parents' generation it's evolved since then, as I'm sure with yours as
Yeah,
well.
for sure.
Like things have shifted and changed, and in some ways for the better, in other ways probably it's gone the other way, not so great ways. I mean, that's kind of how life works. We kind of swing the pendulum, but what we're trying to do is create something that is more holistically integrative. And so, for those that are interested in this, this is part of what the Men's Collective is about. This is part of our foundational pillars, is on top of perspective, is this programming about what it really truly means and how do we show up in the world and bring that into all spaces. And so if you're interested in learning more about what Pierre and I are doing at the Men's Collective, just go to menscollective.co, which has all information about the upcoming cohorts, also about the collective in general. You could also go to the Instagram account, which is menscollective.co. You could find more information there and little clips and trailers that we'll be releasing. And so next week, we're going to be covering the next P, which I'm excited about, which is called, which we have coined principles. And we're going to unpack that a bit more next episode. And again, if you haven't listened to the previous ones, go back and check it out, which helps kind of lay this foundation framework of what the Men's Collective is. And so, yeah, any final closeout comments or thoughts, Pierre, before we
No, man, this is great.
say goodbye? All right.
I think what I'd invite, I hope men who are listening, for whom this resonates, will find themselves looking into joining us in our work. I think it's a huge and important part of how we show up individually as men and maybe collectively as men, but also how we help the next generation of boys and men to show up in ways that really honor our definition for maturity and mature masculinity without feeling constrained or shamed by really rigid ideals or really rigid expectations that may not always serve us. So we need to be able to give ourselves the capacity to be men and also to be maybe not exactly the rigid definition that many of us have grown up with, the one that says, if you don't do this, you're not a man, or you're not enough, or you're not good. Yeah. Because frankly, that's BS.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I agree 100%. I mean, I invite all the men listening, or, if we have wives or moms or sisters, whoever listening, or partners, that you have a man, dad, guy, brother, boyfriend, whatever, that you think would be interested in, just let them share this with them. I mean, this is part of how we're changing, is by there's something I think that a lot of men are longing for, that we hear that men join, is that they're looking for this. They're looking for a space and they don't know where to look. I think that's a big theme that we're seeing, is that there's a need for spaces like this. And there's other spaces. We're not the only space that does this. And I think part of me and Pierre's vision and passion and heart around this too is that we're doing this alongside other men and women creating men's spaces. And we invite you to ours, but also connect you to others too. Like it really is a collective effort. It's not just what me and Pierre are doing, but there really is this longing and need and awakening for spaces like this, for men to show up, to wrestle, to grow, to be heard, to be listened to not be shamed, to not be put down or judged, but to be like part of a community. And so, with that, we're looking forward to going and unpacking more with you guys, and stay tuned to next week as we cover principles. Again, for more information, go to menscollective.co.